Welcome back to Connect and Transform. In today's video, we are going to work on initializing the X and Y axes. But first, I just want to correct some mistakes from the past video. First, I'm going to finish tabbing that function over. One of the mistakes was here on line 50. I had copied and pasted and had an exclamation point beginning the line, so I'm going to get rid of that. Next, there was a line here where we were initializing the y-axis to an empty array of labels, and that should not have been in quotes, so I've just removed the quotes. So now we've fixed the issues from the past video. I'm also noticing I don't like how this is structured. There's just a lot of if-else, more than I intended. So I'm going to restructure it. So I'm going to say here, if the x-axis label is missing, and then I'm just going to move that rule over there. So we're going to set our default tooltip to that if the x-axis label is missing. Otherwise, if the x-axis label exists, then we know we want to set the first line of the tooltip to this value. So let's put that in. And then we'll have this if statement for if the representation is stacked, then we do want to run these selected lines, which is going to initialize total value. And then secondly, we do want to put a second tooltip line in, so we'll do that. And then we can get rid of the rest of this. And that should be all we need. So there's a lot less if-else, less duplication. In fact, there's no duplication because this line, and this line are all different. So let me save that real quick. I'm just going to refresh and make sure there are no errors. And there are no errors except there's something wrong with the validation function. Let's go look at that. So no graph series. So if the graphs data series is null, or we need to get rid of that exclamation. Okay, so let's save, refresh. Good. So we're not seeing any errors anywhere on the screen. So let's move on and look at the init y-axis and init x-axis. The first thing I want to point out, I'm just going to put some comments on the screen reminding everyone of what it is we're building. So our canvas size is 1200 wide by 540 high. Our graph area is 1080 wide by 432 high. And the 432 high is in the range of 68 to 500. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do in init y-axis is we're going to call this scale y-axis function. We're not going to define that one in this video. We'll get back to it in a future one. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to have a couple of constants. So we're going to look at the number of steps in the y-axis, and then we're going to calculate the pixels per step. So the number of steps, that is going to be the following expression. So math.ceiling, and then basically we're going to take the y-axis range. So we're going to be looking at graphdata.y-axis.maxValue minus graphdata.y-axis.minValue. And then we're going to divide it by graphdata.y-axis.stepValue. Okay. Pixels per step is going to be the expression math.floor. And then we're just going to take our vertical range, which is 432 pixels, divided by the number of steps. And then we're going to have some loop. where we're going to be creating our y-axis tick marks and guidelines and axis labels. So we're going to have y ticks, y guidelines, and y-axis labels. And then we're going to produce our main y-axis line. I'm just going to copy some of this. So our tick marks are going to be lines, and we're going to just call the elements y tick, and we're going to be setting some attributes. So we're going to be setting x1, x2, y1, y2. So these tick marks from the y-axis are going to be to the y-axis's left-hand side. They're just going to be short tick marks that are pointing at the y-axis labels. They're not going to be very long, maybe 8 pixels. So they're going to be horizontal lines on the y-axis, which means the y value is not going to change, but the x value will. So the x value will be from 72 to 80. And remember, so the 432 height is 68 to 500. So let's talk about the 1080 width. That's going to be from 80 to 1160. So the tick marks here are going to be from 72 to 80, and our graph area doesn't start until 80. So for y1, that's just going to be the variable y, and we will define y in a moment. y2 is also going to be y. And let's set a class name. And we'll call that axis. And then we are going to append a child to the graph group. So we're going to be appending this tick mark that we just created. So let's go look at y. So in this iterator, we're going to have, in this loop, we're going to have an iterator called I. But then we're also going to have a y value. So for the y, we're going to start at the bottom of the y-axis and work our way up. So the bottom of the y-axis is 500. Our first tick mark is going to be higher, so we're going to subtract some amount. And the amount we're going to subtract is pixels per step. And then the exit condition for the loop is that I is less than the number of steps. So I is going to increase by 1. And then for y, we're going to subtract each time pixels per step. Let me go ahead and save real quick and just refresh the page here. So why is this not showing up? Oh, probably because we haven't styled it. Okay, so we've given it a class name axis. So let's go back up here to the CSS. Line.axis. So we're going to set its color to black. and we'll give it a width of 1. So let's go over here and refresh. Okay, so now we see our tick marks. We'll scroll back down. I'm just going to copy this whole block here to help us get started in coding for the guidelines, which will also be lines. But instead of having a class name of axis, I'm going to give this a class name of axis guide. Our y values will be the same. It'll still just be y, but instead of going from 72 to 80, this will be from 80 to 1160. Now let's go look at this axis guide class. I'm going to duplicate this line, target the axis guide class, and we're going to make the lines a lot lighter, and we're also going to make them less weighty. So I'll save, refresh, must have a typo somewhere. Okay. I'm going to rename this to y guide. That way we're not declaring the same variable twice in the same scope. Okay, so now we've got our guidelines and our tick marks. So let's add our y-axis main line next. So we're going to call this y-axis. Okay, so here the x value is going to be 80 because that is the position of the y-axis, and the y value is going to vary from 68 to 500. We'll give that a class of axis, which is our darker 1 pixel thick line. So I'm going to save that. We'll go back over here, refresh, and now we see our actual y-axis is in place. And then let's finish up this function by putting in our y-axis labels, which will be text elements. Okay, so for our text elements, we are going to have a class name. We're just going to call it y-axis. And then we're going to set a text anchor to end, which right justifies it. We don't need x2 or y2, so we're just going to set x and y. X is going to be 68, which is a little bit to the left of the 72 where our tick marks ended. So our y-axis labels will almost touch the tick marks with a little bit of space. The y positioning will get a slight offset. And then we're going to create the actual value. So that'll be the y-axis label. We'll come back to that expression in a moment. Okay, so then we're going to say y-label dot append child document dot create text node, and we're going to pass in y-axis label. That's this one that we need to define. So for our actual text value, it's going to be format axis value. And so what is the actual value going to be? It's going to be the graph data dot y-axis dot min value plus, and I'm thinking I should probably make sure this is parsed. Plus And then we're going to take graph data dot y-axis dot step value times I plus 1. So let's save there and refresh. Oh, yeah, we haven't defined format axis value, so temporarily I'm just going to say return data value. So we're just going to pass the data right back out of these formatting functions. We will complete those functions in a later video. So there we go. Now we see our unformatted numerical value for the y-axis labels. So that completes the init y-axis function. So let's do the x-axis. So I'm going to move these reminders to the init x-axis function. And so what do we need to keep track of on the x-axis? Well, we need to keep track of the amount of space that each x-axis label is going to take up. So we're going to create a constant and we're going to call it space per label. And that is going to equal our total graph range in pixels, which is 1080, divided by graph data dot x-axis dot labels dot length. Okay, so then we're going to have some loop. I'm just going to copy all of this and we will modify it. So we're not going to have x-axis guidelines because I think that would just make it too busy. So we're going to say for x equals 0, x must be less than the number of labels. X increases by 1. Okay, so we've got our loop defined. So now this is going to be x ticks and x-axis labels and main x-axis line. Let me just get all of these names consistent. Okay. Not a whole lot is going to change here. So our x ticks are going to range from 500 to 508. Because again, 500 is the very bottom of the graphical area, and they're going to extend downward, and they're going to point down at the x-axis labels. The x position is going to be an expression. So we're going to have our offset of 80, because that's where our graphical area starts on the x-axis. And then we're going to add space per label times x plus space per label times 1/2 in order to get things well centered. And so that's going to be true for x1 and x2 and also x. Okay, and then the next thing is, so we've got our x, we've got our y, we've got our class name. I think this one is good. Here we've got our axis. We're going to change our text anchor to middle. Our x positioning is good, and then our y positioning, we're going to say 525. So that's a little bit lower than the 508 where the tick mark ends. So we're putting the x-axis label below our x ticks. And then the actual text value that we're going to put in this node is just going to be our label. So that'll be graphdata.x-axis.labels at position x. And then let's double check our x-axis main line. So our y position is 500 for both y1 and y2. Our x position is going to be across the range of 80 to 1160. And we can keep the class of axis. So let's go ahead and save and refresh. Okay. Let me find my various typos. I'm not seeing it right away. Oh, syntax. Semicolon, not a comma. Okay, so now we see both our x and y axes. Now we can see, like in this second graph, 2021, 2, 3, 4, 5, when there's not a lot of labels, that's working well. And ignore the fact that this one doesn't have a y-axis value. I think that's just because of how I was messing with the data. In this example, we can see both an x and a y, and it's working well. So the one thing I want to do is I want to hide a bunch of these labels here when there's a lot of labels. So let's do that now. So we'll say if the number of labels is greater than or equal to 24 and then what we're going to do is we're basically going to modulo. We're going to take a modulo expression, and then we're going to say if the result of that is not 0, then we're going to just continue and not create our tick marks. So our expression is going to be where x modulo, and then we're going to take the number of axis labels divided by 12. And what this will basically do is it will get rid of every axis label such that we will be left with approximately 12 labels. Now the math works out better when there's a greater number of labels. So the more number of labels there are, the closer we'll be to 12 or 13 labels. If there's 25 labels, then this may not work quite so nicely, but it'll filter out most of them. And we see here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 labels. And then we're going to add one more condition, and that will finish out the function. So the other condition will be if there are more than 8 labels, then we basically want to hide about half of them. So we've already done this condition where there's more than 24, and so this will only happen when there's between 8 and 24. So we want to add a condition that will allow us to continue such that we get rid of about half of the labels. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to say where the number of labels modulo 2 equals x modulo 2. Now there probably won't be any change as I refresh here because we're not hitting that condition with between 8 and 24 labels, but that will have the effect of basically skipping every other label. So there we have it. We have built out our x and y axes with x and y values and labels with some guidelines horizontally off of the y-axis. Thank you for watching.